Today I wanted to talk about the concept that autistic folks sometimes can be better at making friends than non-autistic people. One thing I love to do on my channel is to explore our ideas of autism and the stereotypes, how it may apply to us, and all the ways that it may not apply to us. And it's not necessarily a matter of these autistic stereotypes don't apply to us, period. Oftentimes it's a lot more complicated than that. It's these don't necessarily apply to us in the ways that others think it does, that sort of thing. And if that's the case, how do we explore deeper into that? How do we explore the mechanisms and the why behind it, rather than just keeping it at a surface level of this is what autism is, these are the traits, this is what we're incapable of, end of conversation. Like I said in the beginning of this video, today I wanted to really explore the concept of how autistic folks socialize a lot differently than an average person, how that is seen as a social deficit. But I want to offer up the concept of maybe those social deficits aren't necessarily deficits. Maybe they're just a lot of differences that don't necessarily work in the context of our society. But if we really were to dissect and understand how autistics tend to socialize, we could really draw a lot of value from it and appreciation for it. Does that sound good to you guys? Good? Okay, then let's get down to it and explore together. For those of you who don't know, I've worked with autistic folks for many, many years in different contexts. My first job was actually teaching autistic kids and adults how to swim. That is probably hands down one of my all-time favorite jobs that I've ever worked to this day, because I did not realize how therapeutic that job would be, because I had nothing to really compare it to since it was my first job. All I knew is that I really enjoyed it at the time. It was really grounding for me. I've also worked in the school system with autistic kids. I was certified as a behavioral technician, and now I work with autistic adults one-on-one, right? And so I'm not saying I have a full breadth of experience that spans across all different categories and I'm just so knowledgeable. But what I am saying is that I probably have more experience and knowledge of autistic populations than an average person. I've had the opportunity to work with a lot of different types of autistic adults the past few years, one-on-one. And I've been able to meet autistic folks of different ages, different countries, different aspects of their spectrum, different circumstances in life. And it's been so fulfilling for me. And an aspect of that is really seeing in full detail these different individuals and how complex their life really is, especially in terms of the way that we socialize and the way that we have our relationships and friendships. There's immediately clients I could think about that I have that are extremely extroverted, are extremely good at connecting with other people. You wouldn't expect that because they're autistic, right? But that's the thing here. I think sometimes having social deficits weirdly makes you a lot better at connecting with people than an average person, because there's certain barriers there that people are constantly taught to be mindful of. And there's specific ways that we are taught to respond to those barriers. And I feel like when you're autistic and you don't necessarily see why those barriers are there and why you should respond to them in those specific ways, it provides a really beautiful opportunity of connection that would have never happened for those who are simply assimilated to those roles that we are taught. One very clear example that I could think of is how autistic folks tend to get along really well with people of all different ages and different groups. So how many of you tend to get along with older people or kids, and you don't really seem to get along as easily with people around your age or people who frequent the same spaces as you? I feel like part of having these social deficits is not really seeing why you should only be able to get along with certain types of people. An aspect of it is I am a person full of contradictions, right? Because I'm a human. At the end of the day, I'm not necessarily looking for someone who's exactly like me. I'm more so looking for others who are their own person, but we could at least connect in one specific thing. That specific way of connecting has so much potential within it. And I don't think people are necessarily accessing that potential when they're fully following those social norms. And I'm not saying social norms are bad, right? Social norms could be good for their own reasons. It kind of keeps a generally homogenous way of living and operating to a certain extent. But I also feel like there's a lot of benefits that come from deviating from those social norms in some sort of capacity. I had a client that was an older woman. She was about 50 something years old and she's autistic. And I remember she was talking to me about how she doesn't really see the point in responding to a person in a very specific way when they have a very specific title. So for example, she doesn't necessarily see why she should talk to a celebrity or a CEO a certain way just because they have access to power or money versus a normal person, because they're just people, right? If you get along with them, then you get along with them. If you don't, you don't. But you don't need to edit the way that you're interacting with them based off of their outward social status, if that makes sense. And likewise, she doesn't necessarily see the point in needing to interact with doctors or medical professionals in a certain way just because they have that title. She will be who she is no matter what. And that's seen as a social deficit, right? Like not knowing how to code switch effectively or appropriately, and how because you're unable to do so, you're inappropriate or you're socially inept in these situations. You know, even that whole conversation isn't super straightforward. There are certain aspects of respecting another person that I think should always be there regardless of social deficits, because sometimes I think people could say, I'm just autistic or I have a social deficit, when in reality, they're just being rude. I think there's a way to be attentive to another person and respectful of them and have social deficits. I would love to see society continually move into a direction where we're constantly separating those two things and it's not contingent on each other, right? Just because you have a social deficit doesn't automatically mean you're rude and doesn't automatically mean you don't care or are completely unaware. Social deficits could also be respectful and attentive. You know, things like that. Like people who are socially attuned and assimilated can also be extremely rude and unkind. Of course, when I'm talking about this, I'm not talking about all autistics. There are a good amount of autistic folks out there who still struggle with masking to a point where they still hold themselves accountable to those social norms and they still, whether they want to or not, assimilate, right? And so with those types of autistics, they would probably stick to the status quo of, if I'm categorized in this way, then that means I can only interact with people within this category and nothing else. Regardless of being autistic or not, there are people who hold themselves accountable to that status quo for whatever personal reasons that they have. I'm not talking about those people, of course. Just because I'm talking about one specific type of population doesn't mean I'm saying that that population accounts for everyone else. I would think that people would know that, but I guess people don't, because they tend to take things very personally. And so when I'm talking about something that doesn't necessarily relate to them, they think that I'm projecting characteristics onto them that they don't have. It's not that difficult. It's really just, if this doesn't apply to you, I'm not talking about you type of a thing. You know what I'm saying? I feel like there's something that I always see my clients struggle with, and I feel like I struggled with this as well, is the experience of constantly trying to see when is the right time to talk about something, only to realize that there really is never a right time when a conversation is difficult. But just because a conversation is difficult doesn't mean you keep avoiding it, and doesn't mean that it isn't really, really important to talk about. That is more of a reason to talk about it, because if you don't, then you just sweep it under the rug and you're gonna keep tripping over the rug again and again. And why do that? Why cause more pain? Why carry that weight with you when you could just transmute it together and be rid of it? You know what I'm saying? That does cause a lot of relationship issues, because people aren't necessarily socialized to confront each other in healthy ways or to process confrontation positively. we tend to feel really unsafe with confrontation. People tend to disrespect each other. People tend to get really defensive. People tend to stop listening to each other once confrontation is brought to the table. But I feel like if there is an autistic person who's able to effectively cope with confrontation in a healthy way, there could be a really beautiful facilitation of deeper understanding, deeper transmutation, deeper connection within that relationship dynamic, because you're able to build a lot more trust together, knowing that both people are able to show each other their hands. I'm making a poker reference, I think. Show each other their hands and be able to play through all of it in a symbiotic way. Honestly, the more that I talk about things like this, I come to realize again and again that autistic social deficits is a direct call out to society's broken relationship with confrontation. I mean, you could really take that very simplistic concept and break it down in all different types of situations, and I feel like it will more or less stand true. This one time at my work where my manager was checking in with me about work and where I'm at in my personal life, I always appreciated these check-ins because I felt like it always facilitated really authentic conversations, and it allowed me and the manager to really align in where we're at and how to move forward from there. I never experienced that sort of relationship with any of my other managers, so I really appreciate this manager for being able to intentionally approach that sort of check-in with all of her employees. Not everyone appreciated it, but again, that's also part of the social deficit, is you're able to like or dislike someone because of your own moral values and experiences with them, and there's no sort of bias because everyone else thinks a certain way of that person. So that's another aspect, is a lot of people didn't like this manager, but I genuinely, through all of my experiences with her, liked her. I thought she was a really great, well-rounded person, and I think she's the best manager I've ever had. So I genuinely did not understand why people did not like her. It logically did not make any sense to me. Anyways, back to my check-in story with her. So she was checking in with me, and our conversation started off pretty good. So I was sharing with her where I was at. She started to move the conversation into the area of where I could improve and some of the places I was slacking and not doing so well at. My immediate response to it wasn't to just say, I will listen to exactly what you're telling me, end of story, end of conversation, let's move on. My response to that is to have a conversation. I don't necessarily want to disagree or agree with her, but I want to respond to what she's saying, right? I feel like when you're expanding on a conversation or responding to a conversation, people immediately perceive that as a disagreement and as an act of confrontation, and they get really uncomfortable. And I feel like people don't realize that just because you're responding doesn't mean you're disagreeing. It doesn't mean you didn't hear what they said. Because oftentimes when I respond with something, people will say, you're not hearing me, you're not understanding me. I again and again have to stop them and say, I don't think you realize I do hear you, I do understand you, but can we just keep talking and expanding on that conversation? Like, why am I only able to agree with you as a way to indicate to you that we're not fighting right now? You know what I'm saying? And so I just kept responding to everything she was saying with my thoughts, with anything that came to mind, right? And I was doing pretty well throughout all of this because to me it's just a conversation, but I noticed that she started to tear up, and that was kind of an indication to me this has gotten to a certain point and I might have missed that turning point. Let me catch up a little bit. I realized that she started getting really dysregulated, but she kept powering through because she's a strong woman. For me, again, a part of my social deficit is seeing that she's dysregulated, but my response to it isn't necessarily to stop. My response is, oh, this is bringing something up for her. I recognize it, I see it, but I don't necessarily think the best answer to it is to just stop everything and avoid the confrontation and move on with our lives. If anything, I want her to see that we are able to navigate this to the very end with respect for each other and without it escalating, and being able to come to a conclusion with more understanding of each other and the situation, and and hopefully have a better resolution because of all of that. Eventually we got to a point where at the end of the conversation, I was like, you know what? I totally understand what you're saying. I agree with you. These are the things that I do have to work on. And I appreciate you being able to have this conversation with me and things like that. And I think me reassuring her confused the heck out of her, because I could see her mind really struggling to figure out what was happening. Because on one hand, she was really dysregulated because she perceives our interaction as us fighting, right? But then on the other hand, we have come to an understanding and a better conclusion together. And I feel like that is just a really good example of something that I've experienced in different capacities with all different types of people at different points in my life. This really strong aversion to confrontation. But for those who stick with me through the end of the confrontation, they realize that that wasn't necessarily as bad as they thought it was. And it was actually a lot more productive than normal conversations were. And there's almost like a deeper bond that forms between you and the other person at the end of that confrontation, because there's a lot more vulnerability and honesty that could take place there. I remember a feedback that she gave me after a few of those confrontations happened is that she was always surprised with how much I was able to listen to her, understand her, and how self-aware I was. I guess like she expected me to be really defensive because I always had something to respond with. In actuality, I was never really defensive. I was always very quick to say, you are right, this is what I do wrong. I could be better at that. But at the same time, also have more to say, you know what I'm saying? And so she always thought that that was really interesting, and that always facilitated a lot of conversations that she's not used to having. And I think another aspect of having social deficits is being more curious. Again, I don't think all autistics are going to be curious, because it really depends on where you're at in your own journey of healing and acceptance of yourself. But I find that for those autistics who somewhat have a good relationship with themselves, they tend to be a lot more curious of other people. So when there's other people who do something that we've never done or are interested in things that we've never learned about and things like that, we don't necessarily discount them and say, oh, that's their thing, whatever, move on with our lives. I find that a lot of the times my neurotypical friends are more apt to saying, to each its own, agree to disagree, do your thing. It's not in a negative or judgmental way, but it's more so in a way of like, we aren't in the same circle, so we don't necessarily need to put that much time and effort into getting to know each other in that way. Because you have your group, I have my group. You could go do your own thing over there, I'll do my own thing over here. But I feel like for some autistic folks out there who are similar to me, there's this innate sense of curiosity that we have of people, especially if they're different than us, and the need to go in and really understand people, their special interests, what they like, how they do what they do, you know, things like that. And not necessarily for our own gain, but for the actual curiosity of learning about people and understanding them. That's another thing that I think is different than how autistics tend to socialize versus non-autistics. Is we like to gather information, and it's not necessarily for our own gain or for us to use, but it's just for the simplicity of knowing and learning, being curious, gathering information, right? Whereas I feel like neurotypical people tend to have a more complex filter of, is this information pertinent to me? If not, I don't need to feed more time into it. But if it is important to me, I need to really store it in for context and for very specific reasons to be used in interactions and things like that. Again, that having that social difference or having that social deficit could facilitate a lot of really deep and unexpected connections between different people. But at the same time, I think as well, it could cause a lot of issues, because a common issue that I see my clients and other autistic folks going through is people's adverse responses to our curiosity, us asking questions, us wanting to get to know them. They see it as, why do you want to get to know so much about me? Why are you asking me so many questions? Like, what is your intention? Like, what are you planning here? Why do you need to know all these things? I feel like people have a really hard time accepting that there are people out there who are just curious because they are curious and because they like to learn and observe and understand. And it's not for any specific social reason. It's just interesting information to digest. You know what I'm saying? Because that's a feedback that I've gotten throughout my life as well, is just my propensity to ask so many questions in all different types of contexts to all different types of people. And sometimes people respond with excitement because they see how curious I am and they're excited to dive in deeper and talk about the mechanisms, and they are excited that I'm asking more and more questions so they know that I'm actually listening to them. Whereas other people I find get really put off by my questions and they get kind of suspicious of my intentions and maybe even frustrated with me as to why is this girl asking so many questions? Like, this is weird, and I don't like weird. Weird makes me mad. And a lot of these concepts that I like to explore are always coming in and out of contradicting themes, and I realize that, and I feel like that's what makes these conversations so fun and interesting. On one hand, a big part of being autistic is the need to categorize people, right? And I feel like the component that distinguishes what type of categorizer you are is the component of judgment. So if you're the type of person that likes to pass judgment and to formulate opinions, you're most likely the type of person that is to stick with your categorizations and to not see other aspects of a person that contradicts that category that you already put them in. Those tend to be people who need to rely on judgments in order to feel safe in the world. But I do think there is another category of people, ironically, talking about categories, where we like to be observational. We like to study people's patterns. We like to see what categories a person fits into, and we can make certain predictions of who they could be because of those patterns. But at the end of the day, we don't necessarily form opinions of them or have judgments of them until we've gathered enough objective information. So for example, the video that I made about neurotypical versus neurodivergent gaze, I talk about how you could see the way that someone expresses themselves and sometimes be able to understand other aspects of that person's life and their personality. And people took that as a means of me immediately judging them, right? And I don't think people understood that the type of person I am is I will observe people. I will somewhat categorize them and say, okay, this person's probably more likely to be this or do this. But at the end of the day, I'm not interested in passing judgment. I'm not interested in forming opinions. At the end of the day, I will not know who someone is unless I actually got to know them. And that's the thing, is are you open to changing your opinions of someone and allowing your opinions to be as complex, as contradictory, as nuanced as that person is? Or are you only committed to seeing them in a very specific way? You know, it's more of a matter of this person has these strengths, this person has these weaknesses, they have these struggles. And I feel like when you are that type of person that is observational, that is a pattern recognizer, but you're not committed to forming an opinion or judgment, you're able to form a more accurate view of a person that's free from other people's opinions, judgments, and biases. I think another aspect of being an information gatherer and being an observer is that you're always willing to adjust your view of someone depending on the new information you're getting. And I feel like people don't tend to do that because that's not necessarily socially beneficial, if that makes sense. It's easier to categorize people and to simplify things and to approach interactions with the intention of, are you with me or against me? Are we working together, or are we going to fight for the same resource? You know, things like that. Being the type of person that can understand that everyone is made up of complex characteristics and experiences. You're not good or bad, you're both. You know, it actually weirdly makes things easier because you don't necessarily have to always arrive at a conclusion all the time. Sometimes people can just exist as they are, and you access them when you want to, you draw boundaries when you need to. That's really all it is. But again, all of that ties back to the broken relationship to confrontation. Why socialize in a way that needs confrontation in order to maintain peace if you could build another way to assimilate to each other that means that you could avoid confrontation altogether? You know, I feel like we could definitely form friendships and connections a lot quicker than an average person. And the way that we tend to connect with others and maintain that friendship is also something that is a little bit different as well. You know, some autistic folks like to just do activities with others, so we could spend hours with a person doing something and not really have conversation. And likewise, we could see a friend once a year and spend hours talking to them and catching up, but then other than that, we don't really see or talk to those people. And I think it's interesting to explore the concept of how that facilitates different, sometimes even more connected relationships. But either way, I would love to hear from you guys. What is your experiences like with befriending other people and building connections with other people? Does that deviate from the social norm in any sort of way? And if so, explain how that deviates and why it works for you anyways. I think it'll be amazing to hear all different types of autistics' experiences with building relationships so that we could really see that there's not just one way to connect with other people. And just because we connect in different ways doesn't mean that it's necessarily wrong or less than. With that being said, make sure you guys drink some water today, take some deep breaths, and I will see you on next week's video. Bye.